Good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to be here with you today. I first want to lift up the names of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Parker and all of the people who have lost their lives during this COVID-19 pandemic. The work that we're doing is certainly important, but the lives of our fellow neighbors are more important, and we want to make sure we acknowledge the context in which we're doing this webinar for you. So we want to welcome you to the second installment of the K-12 Education Policy Team at the Center for American Progress's. Beginning last week on May 6th, we launched a series of 5 weekly discussions centered on 5 strategies laid out in our Quality Education for Every Child report. That was released in July of 2019. And now in the face of COVID, it is especially clear that the federal government has a responsibility to ensure the civil rights of students in American schools are upheld. Today's discussion seeks to unpack exactly what the responsibility is as we commemorate the anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. And we'll also revisit the Powell exception in the San Antonio ISD v. Rodriguez case, which clearly states if the civil rights of a protected class of students is violated, use of property tax and zip code to fund schools should be deemed unconstitutional. With that said, I'd like to remind everyone that they're invited to live tweet the discussion using our Quality Ed Chat hashtag. Also, if you have questions for our guests, you can enter them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as time permits. And we definitely want to hear from those of you who are far and near. It's a great honor also to have Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia join us today. Representative Scott serves as the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee in the House of Representatives. Chairman Scott has dedicated his life to public service and has been a fierce advocate for educational equity, not only as a matter of upholding civil rights, but as a matter of social justice. We are so pleased he's able to join us today, and I welcome him to offer opening remarks for us. Rep. Scott?
Well, thank you very much, and it's certainly a pleasure to be with you, and I want to thank Cap for all the good work that you do. We're talking about the federal right to education, and that was really highlighted in the Brown decision in 1954 when the court said that it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. Well, then they went on to say that if you have segregated schools, that is inherently unequal. Well, the Rodriguez case kind of went off the tracks a little bit, but the Brown decision has really been the guiding light over the years. But the equal education is, we know it's a pipe dream when we fund it with the real estate tax, guaranteeing that wealthy areas will have more resources and low-income areas that actually need the resources more. And so in 1960s, the Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to put money into low-income areas under Title I so that the low-income areas would have a fighting chance to provide a better education. We provided opportunities for disabled students when we passed legislation because of the litigation going on for special ed students. But in the early 2000s, we passed No Child Left Behind because we noticed that just getting the money right wasn't enough. We have to make sure that people were actually achieving, and you couldn't leave children behind. You couldn't have entire groups of people underachieving. The unfortunate thing with No Child Left Behind was the inflexibility and the dysfunctionality. So we passed Every Student Succeeds Act a few years ago. It gave much more flexibility to the localities. But as we considered the Every Student Succeeds Act, we gave no flexibility on the requirement that you ascertain whether or not there are achievement gaps. They don't tell you how to do it, but you have to ascertain whether or not there are achievement gaps. And there's no flexibility on your requirement that you have to do something about it. You have to have a credible plan to eliminate the achievement gaps. The Department of Education is supposed to review state plans to make sure that they're credible. And I think there's some good state plans. Unfortunately, I think the department has approved some that just aren't so hot. Uh, while this was going on, we a few years ago asked for a GAL study to look at segregation in schools, and regrettably, they came to the conclusion that segregation in schools is bad, about as bad as was in the 1960s, and getting worse. And not only segregated by race, but also by class. Um, and so we held I chair the Education and Labor Committee, and we held our first hearing on school segregation about a year ago. And I was told this is the first hearing that was been held on school segregation in about 30 years. And so we're looking at things to actually do something about it. The Strength and Diversity Act and the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act. The Strength and Diversity Act is a little grant program patterned after a program that President Obama proposed on its way out, a little $30 million program to give technical assistance to localities that wanted to voluntarily integrate the schools. Because of the Louisville and Seattle case, we're finding that you can integrate the schools, but you have to be careful. Otherwise, you might cross the line and get overturned on a constitutional basis. But you can do it, and they were going to provide the technical assistance and how it could be done. Unfortunately, when the Trump administration came in, they canceled the program before any grants went out. We want to codify that program so that those that want to do the right thing are able to do it. The Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act has its major provision making Title VI cases, giving an individual right of action to Title VI cases. Right now, you got to wait for the Department of Education to move, and if they don't move, nothing happens. We want to make sure there's a private right of action. So if you can have a local group bring an action, they can go ahead and do it. It provides for a deputy secretary of education focused on school integration and diversity issues, and provides, just like Title IX, every local education agency ought to have somebody designated throughout the system as the Title VI enforcement officer to make sure there are no Title VI violations. That's those two bills, Strength and Diversity and the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, have both been reported from the Education and Labor Committee and awaiting floor action. But one of the things we've noticed in the CARES, in the COVID-19 pandemic, is the same thing that has happened, we've noticed in the healthcare area, where there are disproportionate deaths. The universal conclusion is that it was a result of underlying pre-existing disparities. We're doing the same thing in education. I have a friend that lives in a wealthy area of Atlanta. He said the schools closed on Friday. His son was getting instruction online by Monday morning. He has a brother in Virginia who said that weeks later, his nephew hadn't gotten any instruction at all. Those disparities are all over the system and exist. And this pandemic is just exacerbating achievement gaps. Those that are behind are falling further behind. Special education students they asked for a waiver to just kind of get away from any obligation. We were fortunate that the waiver did not take place. But even with no waiver, the special ed students are not getting nearly the kind of education that they desperately need under the free and appropriate education standard. But we need to take action, and we're taking action. We had a little appropriation in the CARES Act for local for K through 12, and in the HEROES Act that we'll be considering Friday, there's additional education. But of course, the number one thing we have to do as legislators is backfill the revenue shortfalls in state and local government, because if they suffer the kind of projected shortfalls they're projecting. The fact is that the education has got to be hit hard, and the federal government will never make up for those deficits. We need to make sure that under the bill we're considering Friday, there's if we get all we're looking for, and this is just the House bill, we may be able to backfill virtually all of those revenue shortfalls. They're important. Virginia finished its General Assembly session just as the pandemic was kicking off. We came back 6 weeks later to consider the revised revenue shortfalls, and we lost the 2% teacher raise. We lost a significant reduction in tuition at community colleges, freeze on college tuitions. One college lost $100 million in construction. Additional counselors in the schools were lost. Money for at-risk schools, all of that was lost because of the revenue shortfalls. If we can restore the revenue, all of that comes back in, and then the money, the $100 billion we have for education that can be used for summer programs, special education, achievement gaps, on all of that, gaps in connectivity and technology, all of that money will be a step forward, not something that would just partially fill in the gaps that we have. So we're working on trying to maintain equity in education. We view it as a federal right, but we have a lot of work to do to maintain the right to an education that is so important for people's future. So for the Center of American Progress, thank you for all you do, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Great, thank you, Rep. Scott. We really appreciate your insight into what's going on behind the scenes and what people should think about as it relates to advancing the federal right to education and protecting the civil rights of our students. I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm Kalila Harris. I'm the Managing Director for the K-12 policy team at the Center for American Progress. So welcome again. I want to introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Derek Black. He's a professor of law at the University of South Carolina. Denise, welcome, Derek. Let me pause. Great. Denise Ford had an issue come up and won't be joining us today, but I'm pleased to also introduce Carmel Martin, who was formerly Senior Vice President for Partnerships and Policy at the Center for American Progress. Welcome, Carmel. I did not say the right thing. Former Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. Welcome, Carmel. Thank you. Last but not least, Professor Kimberly Robinson is Elizabeth D. and Richard A. Merrill Professor of Law and a Professor of Education at the University of Virginia. Welcome, Professor Robinson. All right, and Rep. Scott is going to stay with us through the duration of this conversation and be answering some questions. So again, just want to remind everyone, if you would like to participate in the conversation, please share your questions in the Q&A box, and you can also engage the broader public on #QualityEdChat via Twitter. So first, Professor Robinson, let me start with you. You recently published a book, A Federal Right to Education. That's an edited text talking about exactly the topic we're discussing today. Will you share some of the touch points and highlights in our history that shaped the fight for acknowledging that there's a federal right to education?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, because we do want to understand that there has always been a federal role in education. It has evolved and changed over time. But even as early as 1785 and 87, when we had the Northwest Ordinances, we really focused on ensuring that schools were established and had financial support, and that education was encouraged. And so even our nation's early history, as we were building a democracy, we understood that democracy and education go hand in hand. And so what you have to understand is that in a democratic nation, you have to have an educated citizenry to hold leaders accountable, to be able to vote in ways that are informed by an understanding of the issues. And so you have to make sure that all children receive that education so that as they become of voting age, they're able to exercise their democratic rights, not just at the federal level, but also state and local elections as well. So if you fast forward to, after the nation was involved in the Civil War, what you see is that when we sought to readmit states, and this is work that Derek Black has scholarship that he's done that's been exceptional. So when we were seeking to readmit the southern states into the Union, the Congress required the states to have some protection for education in their state education clauses. And so what that tells us again is we saw that education is really central to understanding our union. And so if you fast forward to more modern history, what you've seen is a substantial expansion of the federal role in education, really starting with Brown. So Brown's role in school desegregation really laid a pathway for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which has really expanded the federal role in education. And so what we see is that the federal government has always understood that it needs an educated citizenry to have a stable democracy. But also what we've seen is that the states have not always ensured that students have that education. And so the federal role has grown to address where states neglect issues of equity. And so that is sort of a brief summary. I mean, I teach whole classes on it, so those are really short answer. I can elaborate on any of those points. So.
No, that's fine. We're not asking you to grant free tuition in this short webinar.
Yeah.
So
Try to keep
you
it short.
so much. Thank you. We appreciate you being succinct. So with that said, what would it take for us to recognize a federal right or a constitutional right to education? Education is the one word that does not appear in our Constitution. If we were able to establish a constitutional right, what are some of the guarantees that should exist there, and what affirmative steps should the federal government take to protect those guarantees?
Yes, so there's several avenues that you could take. So legislation is certainly possible. So certainly Congress, just as it's passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, could recognize a right to education. You could also have it implied through the Constitution. So there's a number of avenues to get there. But in terms of the guarantee, which seemed to be the focus of your question, really you want to ensure an opportunity to learn the aims, an opportunity to learn the aims of education, So in other words, providing things like highly qualified teachers, adequate funding, and equitable funding, things like a rigorous curriculum and just sort of other opportunities to learn that ensure that you achieve certain aims. So if the aim is an educated citizenry that can be prepared to vote and serve on a jury, you want to make sure students have strong analytical skills, strong, ability to critique the issues of the day and understand what they're voting on. When you look at the standards movement, you really get a sense of exactly what each of the states are focused on. And so we would want to ensure that there's some kind of guarantee that students have an opportunity to learn what's in the standards that states have adopted. So there's a variety of aims that you could adopt. It could be an educated citizenry. You could focus on, in the book, Rachel Moran focuses on a right to compete, ensuring students are able to compete with one another, not just within their state, but we have a national and international workforce now. So you want to have the ability to compete with others, your peers in other states. So you want to sort of try to fold those in to frame what opportunities to learn each child has. So you want to establish the aim and then work backwards to what do you need in terms of opportunities to achieve those goals.
Great, thank you. That makes perfect sense to me. Professor Black, let me pivot to you a little bit. Will you talk a little bit more and dig deeper into how the Brown v. Board decision really changed the course in public education as it relates to who has access to uh, what quality of schooling in this country.
Yeah, I mean, there is no way to overstate the importance of Brown versus Board of Education. It is probably the most important decision that the court has ever issued. This was a country founded on slavery and had operated it for a few hundred years. And even after it formally ended, it took another 100 years or close to it for the Supreme Court to get involved. And then, of course, once that happens, it becomes the foundation for many of the things that Representative Scott was speaking about, not just in terms of race, but in terms of disability, in terms of gender, in terms of homeless children. So it really changes everything. At the same time, I think we can get easily carried away with Supreme Court decisions. Supreme Court justices' power is actually far more limited than we tend to believe it is. I think President Eisenhower was rumored to have said that if the Supreme Court wants to desegregate schools, it can do it themselves. Well, that amounts to a few marshals around the Supreme Court running around the nation. That just ain't going to happen. So ultimately, after Brown versus Board of Education, it's about a decade before any children attend desegregated schools at all. In fact, there were a few African American children prior to Brown that somehow or another had managed their way into all white schools. So something like a tenth of 1%. That number went to like 5/10 of 1% or something like that in a decade. So you still have a South that for a decade did absolutely nothing to desegregate its schools. And it really is Congress lining up behind the court that creates the huge turning point. So with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Congress finally says, if you don't desegregate, if you don't comply with court orders, then we're going to take away your federal money, that primarily being the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that Representative Scott was speaking about. So with those teeth, we see in the late 60s, the percentage of African American children attending integrated schools skyrocketing. So from less than 1% to over 40% in about a decade. So it was, when people say desegregation failed, that's just not accurate. What they really should say is that we stopped trying to desegregate our schools and the courts allowed them to resegregate. So, Brown sets the foundation for that. And as I said, a number of other forms of integration for other students disadvantaged and on other categories.
Thanks so much for that wider lens. Just pushing out a little further, we recently saw the Gary B. versus Whitmer case in Michigan. A recent decision found on behalf of the plaintiffs in terms of what Michigan is required to provide their students. Will you talk about how the Whitmer case has changed the landscape and what we might expect in future litigation around this issue?
Yeah, so I mean, the Gary B decision is about as inspiring as it gets when you read the words written on the paper. I find that Judge Clay said a lot of things in that opinion that are correct that no one's ever said before other than scholars. And so, I give him a tremendous amount of credit for doing that. With that said, I would be honest, I think the future is pretty bleak in the Sixth Circuit in particular. There's already 2 petitions for en banc review filed there. So it seems to me that case will be taken up by the full Sixth Circuit. And there are 11 Republican appointees on the Sixth Circuit and only 5 Democratic ones. In fact, Donald Trump all by himself has appointed more people to the Sixth Circuit than President Obama and President Clinton combined. So we are not looking at good odds there. Even if somehow or another you got past the Sixth Circuit, or if plaintiffs appealed to the Supreme Court, we've got a Supreme Court which has been in the business of rolling back civil rights for the last 2 or 3 decades, not expanding them. Really, the only exception to that I see is in regard to LGBTQ rights. So I don't see a favorable court there. We have another litigation going on in Rhode Island right now that'll make its way through. It's got a really strong theory there as well, but I honestly don't see how we succeed at the higher levels with those cases. With that said, I think the rationales are excellent, and the reality is what the reality is, I suppose.
So we have a hard way to go. It's the paraphrase version of that. All right, that's helpful. What are some of the other challenges you see to securing a federal right to education beyond this uh, legal landscape and using the court system?
Yeah, well, on that, I'll say that things are a lot more positive. I mean, first of all, what we're really talking about are personalities on the federal judiciary that change. But if we look at the facts and the historical record, they are incredibly strong. As Kimberly began getting into a moment ago, I think America is just finally coming to realize the full scope of its historical commitment to education. And you say, well, that sounds like something a scholar has made up. Why would it be 2020 that we're just coming to this realization? And the answer I often give is that this is tied up with our history of slavery and segregation. I mean, Jim Crow, for a good 90 years, did everything it possibly could to bury the right to education. And to deny any of the truths about what the freedmen had achieved for themselves and what Congress had tried to achieve for the freedmen, and for that matter, for poor whites in the South as well. So there's a very, very powerful story following Reconstruction, and I think that's coming to light, and finally, after a long time, and of course, the founding as well. There's a lot of complicated sort of ways to interpret what's going on with the Constitution and the Northwest ordinances that Kimberly mentions. So I won't dive into them now, but we've got a rich history. And so I think, that gives, average folks, I think, strength to say, well, whatever the legal arguments are, I can understand history, right? And we've got a strong history there. And we've also got tremendous work happening in the state courts, where they call it the fundamental right or constitutional right to education in all 50 state constitutions, and litigants have been winning there. In fact, just last week, a trial court in Tennessee struck down Governor Bill Lee's attempt to push forward vouchers in the middle of the pandemic at the expense of public school children in Nashville and in Memphis. So we see those sort of state courts doing great work there. Finally, long-windedly, what else is left of the federal role? Well, there really isn't anything that we need in public education that Congress cannot do through legislation. I think what we saw is a slate of presidential candidates, all of whom spoke about tripling and quadrupling the federal investment in Title I, and Elizabeth Warren's policy was really robust in laying out the details of that. And of course, we've got Chairman Scott on the line now. If there's anyone who's been with us through thick and thin, through minority and majority leadership, it has been Senator Scott. So to have him in that seat also gives me a lot of encouragement about what could be possible.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And that was something that was laid out in our quality education report, that there are, there is a critical need for the federal government to take a look across the country and fulfill the right of students to have a basic quality in education. And we also propose a quadrupling of resources being invested into public education by the federal government, especially since most people think the federal government is contributing somewhere to between 25 and 30% to public education, and we know it's more like 7 to 8%, which is always a shocker for people. But thank you for that. And speaking of funding, Carmel, I'd love to pivot to you and talk a little bit more about the Rodriguez decision and how we fund public schools. Your chapter in Professor Robinson's book talked about funding structures for public education. We know in the Rodriguez case, the conservative court under Justice Powell said that income was not a protected class under the Constitution, therefore found against the plaintiffs in that case, stating that it was not a problem for property taxes to be used and zip code to be used to fund schools, but in an exception did say that if a protected class in the Constitution, such as race, were experiencing vast inequity, that in that case it would be rendered unconstitutional to use property tax. With that in mind, where should we be going to establish a disruption in use of property tax and more progressive ways to fund schools?
Thanks for that question, and thanks for having me today, and thanks for everybody else for tuning in today. I know it's a very stressful time. I hope everyone's doing well. The chapter that I worked on with colleagues at CAP for the book, and we also did a paper for CAP on it, looked back on the state-based litigation around school finance reform, and based on that, gleaned some recommendations for moving forward, whether we move forward through litigation at the state context or through federal legislative action. And I think it's pretty well established that property taxes, relying heavily on property taxes with respect to funding education, is going to continue to lead to pretty deep inequities in funding based on income and based on race. There was a great report put out last year by EdBuild that demonstrated that the gaps in funding between predominantly schools that are made up majority of students of color versus schools that are made up predominantly of white students, that the gap nationally between those types of schools is $23 billion, and that held constant. So that's across the country, we see that there's these continuing gaps, not just based on income, but also based on race. And you see in the national debate around education reform, the issue of closing those gaps based on race is elevating, at least with respect to the Democratic primary. If you look at the candidates across the Democratic primary, many, if not most of them, pointed to that gap as something that they thought should be a priority for closing. So I think that's good news that people are focused on those gaps and I think that's something that can be tackled in terms of federal policy and or civil rights enforcement, since the court has recognized that gaps based on race are unacceptable. I think the other thing that's a positive development since I was doing school finance litigation in the 90s is that there's a growing body of evidence that money does matter, which sounds very intuitive, but when I was litigating these cases in the 90s, that wasn't a given, that more money would make a difference. Now we have some really compelling evidence that it does matter, and it particularly matters for low-income students and students of color. So that's really important both for the litigation debate, arguing this in the courtroom or arguing this from a public policy standpoint. And I hope that there's a growing recognition that because it's connected to inequity based on race and income, the federal government does need to step up and do more in terms of education. And I do think you see, at least with respect to people coming from the progressive side of the debate, you see a growing push for the federal government having even more substantial investments coming from the federal government and tying those investments to states and districts funding their education systems in a more equitable way. You see a growing focus on weighted student formulas, which take into consideration the fact that equal doesn't mean the same. If we're really going to have equity in education, we have to recognize that some students are going to need additional resources. And that was a big something that we focused on in our paper, that in some of the state-based litigation, the focal point was on having equal funding between rich and poor districts, as opposed to ensuring that students have the building blocks of a high-quality education. And as a result, the litigation ended in higher wealth districts being told they can't spend as much as they want, and a sort of Robin Hood effect. In Texas, they called it the Robin Hood bill. And it turned out that it didn't lead to the results that I think were the desired results in the litigation, because it meant pulling everybody down to the lowest common denominator instead of asking ourselves, what do students need to be successful, and making sure that all students have equal access to those core components of a high quality education. So in our paper, we sort of zeroed in on that as well, is that as we move forward, again, whether it's through litigation or federal policy making, we really need to not just be making sure that students don't get less money because of their zip code or the color of their skin, but where necessary, they get more money. For example, students with disability, English language learners, and that we also are looking at if they have disparate access to core components of a high quality education, whether that's early childhood education or AP courses or college prep courses, that we have to be sort of looking under the hood of the financial numbers and make sure that everybody's getting access to the type of education they need to be successful.
Thank you, Carmel. That's extremely helpful. And Rep. Scott, I'm going to pitch one more question to Carmel and then come to you for another question before we open up to the chat box, if that's okay. So Carmel, we saw after Brown v. Board this rush to send students out of their communities to other schools as opposed to an investment in the schools in the communities where the children live. How do you think we balance that as we now see greater calls for desegregation again? How do we balance using federal legislation, kind of this knee-jerk reaction of move the kids to the schools that seem to have more versus what you were just talking about, providing equitable funding so that families can stay where they are and develop in their neighborhood?
Well, as a former desegregation lawyer, I do believe that there is value in having diversity among the student body, among the teaching workforce. So I think that efforts to create greater integration break down segregation that's often caused by housing policy and other discriminatory policies, that we should be tackling those at both from the perspective of litigation and federal policymaking, because I honestly believe that having my children being able to go to a school where everybody doesn't look like them is an affirmatively good thing and will contribute to a better education for them. That said, I think where we do have schools that are predominantly of one race or another, we also need to ensure that the students in those schools are getting equitable resources, which again could mean more than the school next door, and that the core components of a high quality education are something that there's equal access to. There should be universal access to high quality preschool education. Everyone should have the opportunity to take a college prep course of study if that's what they want to do. Everyone should have the opportunity for high quality career and technical education programs that lead to good jobs. Everyone should be able to be taught by an experienced teacher who's paid a professional wage and treated as a professional. So I think that we need to be looking for that consistency across our education system, while also celebrating and encouraging efforts to promote diversity and integration across our communities and our schools.
Thank you. And I appreciate you pushing against kind of that schools alone strategy that we've seen in the past couple of decades for how we improve the lives of people. And that, you know, if we are committed to integration, there are these other systems that we need to come to the table as an ecosystem to decide, you know, what's strongest for our country. And it is for our children to be sitting next to each other and learning about contexts that they don't live in or backgrounds that they don't have, so that they can be stronger citizens, better able to take care of themselves, especially when they encounter people who aren't like them. But that idea that that can only happen by moving students to other communities and not really fixing the other pieces of it, I think is where we fall short. And I appreciate you offering that lens of, hey, these other systems are contributing to what's making it so hard for families to live together so that their kids can go to school together. So thank you for that. Rep. Scott.
Hello.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, before we move to the chat room, will you talk about what other levers people aren't typically looking at when they think about providing equitable access to quality education? So we know we have ESSA, but what are some of the other ways we should be looking at pushing for every student to have access to a quality education?
Well, I think it's just been heard that under Brown, the finding was that even if the tangible factors were equal, the segregated education denies the children of the minority race of an equal educational opportunity. That's even if the tangible factors were equal, but the fact of the matter is they're never equal. And we found that if you can integrate the schools, and the minority children are much more likely to have an equal educational opportunity. And it's also been pointed out that equitable does not mean equal. Many of the children in most need more resources, not equal resources, in order to achieve a decent education. But the Department of Education is one. You've indicated that there's not a high portion of the federal money, but the federal money goes to where it's most needed. The mainstream education, the state and local can take care of, but it's the ones on the fringes that always get left out in the normal give and take in politics. That's the low income, minorities, English as a second language, disabled students who are much more expensive to educate. Those are the ones that usually get left out. And that's where the federal government can have the best impact, to make sure that those groups are not left behind. And Department of Education needs to enforce all of the regulations, the disaggregated information, disaggregated data, to make sure that the achievement gaps are eliminated. ESSA provides that opportunity, but it depends on the Department of Education, and forcing them to do right is so important. People tend to look at the federal government. You should start with the school board, your local school boards, your local city council and state legislatures. Since only a small portion is coming from the federal government, most of it's coming from state and local. And we have to make sure that the funding formulas on the state and local basis are equitable. The ESSA requires an understanding of the school-based expenditures. And if you just look at the money spent in a school in the inner city, money spent in the school in the suburbs, it's nowhere close. And just the payroll, for example, the teachers in the inner city tend to be the beginning teachers. And if you just look at the payroll, if you had a payroll hundreds of thousands of dollars more in one area than the other, of course you're going to have better teachers. So you have to look at all of the data that's made available under ESSA, particularly the resource allocation, and that's on a local and on a state basis, because within a state there are inequities, even within a city there are inequities, and we shouldn't stand for that. And that's why the local cause of action under Title VI is so important.
That's very helpful. You know, people say education policy is local, and oftentimes people are waiting on someone to come and support them, and very few people are taking action at the local level to take control of schools, even though they believe they should have control over schools from a community standpoint. Something else you said, Rep. Scott, earlier around the HEROES Act and CARES 2 related to a couple of things. One of them, and I'm going based on the questions that are here in the chat box, and anyone can answer. One of those things is around technology, and whether it be through E-rate or some other structure, we will see legislation that supports all school systems having access to Wi-Fi and technology, so that students are not in a position to be without education, as you said, from your friend, the difference between Atlanta and Virginia. And then secondarily, there was a question here about state budgets being cut so deeply that schools are not able to bounce back from that. So anybody can jump in on that, but Rep. Scott,
let me start off with the funding. That's why the state and local funding and the next federal funding bill, the one we're going to take up Friday, is so important. Education on the local level is such a huge portion of the budget, and if you hold harmless public safety and picking up the garbage I mean, there's some things that you're not going to be able to do much with. Education is just a sitting duck. So if we don't backfill the local and federal expenditures, I just went through a list of kind of things that had been appropriated before the pandemic that are being lost now. Now that the pandemic is alive and well, we can see the difference. And you can ask just one college, they lost $100 million in funding. In the technology, one of the things we're finding, if you're spending thousands of dollars, $10,000 or so on each student, making sure each one has a Chromebook that can cost in bulk a couple $100, bridging that divide just is not that expensive. And there's no excuse to have children sitting at home with no devices. The connectivity, a lot of people qualify for significant discounts on connectivity. If you qualify for some of the um, uh, programs, SNAP benefits or others, that might entitle you to a significant reduction in your cable bill. There's not a whole lot of outreach on that, and we need to make sure that all of the students who are eligible can take advantage of that. But the technology, we hear a lot about rural broadband. Some areas, entire areas, don't have Wi-Fi. Some schools are not wired up so that the teacher can get on and teach a class. I mean, a lot of platforms, you can look at 25 little boxes. You can have the whole class. If you had 25 or less in your class, you can have everybody on one screen. If you don't have the connectivity in your school, you can't do that. But rural broadband is just one part of it. Some of it is inner city lack of access. And even if you have access generally, if the family doesn't have access, the fact that everybody else in the area has it doesn't help that student. So we've got to make sure that each and every area is covered and each and every student is covered. And with the amount of money we're spending on each individual, a little extra to make sure that each student is empowered with the Chromebook or whatever and is connected, the little extra isn't really that much.
I think that's right. We just saw a couple of articles, or at least one article, just a couple of days ago about 4 children who were waiting turns to use the one Chromebook that their family was able to get access to. And so even if you have Wi-Fi or a single hotspot on someone's cell phone, if there aren't devices, it doesn't matter. But if you have the devices and no Wi-Fi, it also doesn't matter. So that's really critical and something for us to lift up. Particularly what I hear you saying is there are already opportunities for advocates to make sure people have access to wireless connectivity. I want to push us to another question. And so that was 2 questions from the chat combined. I want to see if we can get a third in. And this one is about maintaining FERPA and HIPAA protections for our students with disabilities, but I'd also say students who were out on suspension or are in our juvenile facilities. How do we make sure these children are getting their services, but we're not foregoing their rights under HIPAA and FERPA? And anyone can take that. I see heads nodding that, yeah, that's a good question.
Well, can I go back to the last question, actually, since we don't have an
Sure.
answer to that? Well, I
Sure.
think, Congressman Scott raises a couple of really good points about the state and local funding and focusing there. One thing though I would add is, and it's something that I know several of us have been pushing on for quite a while, is that the Title I dollars that go out to states don't have sufficient conditions to make sure that states themselves are spending their own money fairly. And so I know Elizabeth Warren's plan, for instance, talked about how we could add some additional conditions so that states, when they take that money, part of the deal is they spend their own money, more fairly. And then the other issue, I think, again, as Congressman Scott was hitting on, is this backfill problem when the federal government gives out money during the pandemic. If we look back at our last recession, Congress gave, I think it was $300 or $400 million to basically make sure teachers didn't get laid off, and that money carried states for about 2 years. And what states did was take all of the money they were going to spend on public education, move it elsewhere. And then when Congress's money ran out, it was actually 2 years after the recession that they hit a fiscal cliff. And so there was enormous drop off during those periods. And, we've spent the last 7 or 8 years trying to get states to get back to where they were in 2008. And so, I would just hope that, that's one of the things that we can focus on, is as much as we want to help states, we have to be cognizant that some of them may not always do the right things by education. And that, it's a tough thing to spell tough conditions during a pandemic. But if ultimately this money is for our low income children, I think past history suggests we have to be a little bit tougher about that. Yeah.
And for that reason, we're going to try to get a maintenance of effort that you at least spend on education what you're spending before, after we backfill, so that whatever money we put on education can actually be a step forward, not supplanting, not what they would have done anyway. It should be a plus up, not just filling in what they were going to do anyway.
And just to jump in on that point, I was working at the Department of Ed when ARA was implemented, and I do think the Obama, obviously I have a biased perspective here, but I do think the Obama administration did a pretty good job of ensuring the stabilization funding under ARA didn't lead to states simply moving money away from education to a different function. I mean, to a certain extent, the money we're talking about is designed to supplant state dollars, not in terms of the regular budget cycle, but in terms of relief stemming from an economic recession. The idea is state budgets are going to go down. You want to make sure teachers keep their jobs and children get the same education, at least. Obviously, they should get more. So it's a little tricky to imply a simplistic maintenance of effort frame, but as Congressman Scott pointed out, the way to do that is to make sure that their cuts to education are not deeper than other state and local funded services, and so you're not worsening the situation of the education system by putting the federal emergency relief on top of it.
Let me be clear. When I say supplement, not when I say maintenance of effort, if we give them state and local money, then they're locked into a maintenance of effort. The extra money we give specifically for education then would be a plus up. Obviously, the whole point of backfilling the revenue shortfalls is to make up for what they can't do, and so that would go to help them maintain their effort. But once the state and local money is accepted, then they should be obligated to spend on education what they spent, at least what they spent last year. And then when we come up with $100 billion extra for education, it's an additional step to supplement what they were doing, because we've got extra summer programs, we've got extra connectivity, we've got extra achievement gap problems. There are a lot of special ed. We've got a lot of problems we're trying to deal with. That will be in addition to locking in with the state and local money as a separate pot. So you're right. Some of the money we're going to give them will be just to backfill and be able to, but that's just the state and local money. For education, it should be a supplement.
So I'm going to jump in on the juvenile justice point.
So I'm gonna let you do that. I want to say thank you to Carmel Martin, who had to just jump off at 2. Professor Robinson, go right ahead, and this will be our last comment.
Sure. So the question about juvenile justice and what to do. So unfortunately, the juvenile justice system before the pandemic, juvenile justice youth were being neglected and their educational needs were being neglected. And so one of the reasons why we need a federal right to education is that every child, whether they're at an alternative school or they're at a regular school, they should have a means of insisting that the states and localities ensure they get the education they need. And so the juvenile justice challenge is that we don't have that. And so then they're left to state rights to education, which vary widely and don't have the ability to advocate for the education that they will need upon leaving the juvenile justice system. And so this is an area that was neglected before the pandemic and it's likely to worsen unless we shine a light on the needs of these students to receive an education upon, upon leaving the juvenile justice system.
Absolutely. There was another question from Liz in the chat about how we rely on state courts in the face of the pandemic, considering the drop off in resources. I think Rep. Scott and Carmel just spoke to that a bit, as well as Professor Black. But I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Carmel Martin, former Executive Vice President at the Center for American Progress, Professor Robinson from UVA and author of, or the editor of the text, A Federal Right to Education, Professor Derek Black from University of South Carolina, and Congressman Bobby Scott. Thank you all. Next week, we have our next event, and it's going to be on preparing students in grades K through 8 for the future workforce. Thanks, everyone.